Welcome everyone. This is the first in a series of training videos designed to help judges, coaches, and team members all prepare to participate in Ethics Bowl competitions, including the Intercollegiate Ethics Bowl regional competitions and the API Intercollegiate Ethics Bowl National Championship in the spring. As you can see, I'm on the API website page for cases, rules, and guidelines, where you've obviously found this video. And what I'm having you look at here is some of the links we're going to be taking a look at. So we have the guide to asking judges questions, the guide to scoring for judges and teams, and the API IEB etiquette link. So what we're going to do is I want to show you each of those resources, walk through them one at a time, and then in a separate series of videos, we will take a look at a sample case. And the sample case is actually one that's done virtually. So you will get a chance to get a feel for what that feels and looks like for teams, coaches, and judges for this year. So let me start by taking a look at the guide to scoring for judges and teams, which was revamped a year ago. And many of you may be less familiar with it, even if you've been participating in Ethics Bowl activities for a long time. So I'm going to go over there. And here is our guide to scoring for judges and teams. Now, if you see, a lot of the numerical scoring is the same as it always has been. It's a 1 to 10 scale. What we've done, though, is revamped the rubric to just give you a little more of a guideline. Many judges in the Ethics Bowl competitions come from academic backgrounds and may be used to thinking in terms of letter grades, and obviously many of the competitors are used to this as well. So one way to think about the scores is you have your numerical score 10, truly exceptional. Think of that as A+, essentially a perfect score, right? So these are very, very rare. 9 is your outstanding grade, and so a nice sort of letter equivalent to that is an A that you might see in an assignment. We don't do fractional scoring, or 8.5, for example. So the next grade down is 8, and so one way to think about that, that's very solid, still a very impressive performance. A high B or low A would be sort of a grade equivalent. A 7 is, again, still solid, and so the equivalent there is like a solid B. Once we get to 6 and below, that's when we start to think in terms of not level of strength, but maybe level of weaknesses. So with 6, you've begun to see some noticeable weaknesses or omissions, and so you're starting to think about sort of a high C, low B. These become more serious when you get down to the level of 5. Sort of a low C type of grade. 3 and 4 are, real serious flaws, and so a grade equivalent to them might be a D. And you very rarely see grades below a 5 or scores below a 5 in Ethics Bowl competitions, but you might. And one place that you might see a 1 or a 2 is actually in the consideration of alternative viewpoints. So if there is anything that's sort of almost entirely absent from a team's analysis, that's when you'd see a 1 or a 2, and the letter grade there equivalent would be an F. So with those in mind for numerical scoring, let's take a look at the actual categories. So first we have the initial presentation. And when this was redesigned, the idea was to make this something that could be a resource not just for judges, but also for teams and coaches. So I want to walk you through this in some level of depth. First, you have the initial presentation. And the initial presentation is made up of 3 components: clarity and organization, ethical analysis, and considering alternative viewpoints. But we want to talk in detail about each of these. So let's start with clarity and organization. So the first thing it says here is that the team should make their answer to the moderator's question clear. In other words, the moderator is going to ask an explicit question. The team should have a clear and explicit answer to that question at some point in their presentation. Of course, part of clarity and organization is that teams should present a discussion that's clear and easy to follow. And of course, and this is, I think, where it begins to become interesting, terminology used should be explained or be such that an educated person could follow it. So if a team uses a technical term that might be known only in certain disciplines, they should assume that someone in their audience may not be familiar with that term. Of course, some of this is also common sense. Teammates should not talk over one another. This will be a little trickier in a virtual environment. So judges should sort of adjust their expectations a little bit for this year, given that it may be harder for teammates to know when each other are finished speaking than it would be in a normal year. One of the things we did this when we revamped the scoring guidelines is we wanted to really incorporate right into the guidelines things that we want to strongly discourage judges from taking into account. So I want to walk through this as well. These things should not be considered as part of the score. Attire or physical appearance of the team members should not be taken into consideration. The volume of speech or eye contact of team members should not be taken into consideration. Now, there's a caveat here, of course. If you can't hear somebody at all, then obviously you can't give them a decent score for clarity and organization. What we're trying to get at, though, is this idea that sort of rhetorical flourish is not something that you're evaluating teams on. Another thing that often comes up when we hear feedback from teams and judges is this idea of how many people spoke in a presentation. Some teams will prepare such that a given member of the team is sort of the resident expert of a particular case. So they might respond almost entirely in the presentation. Other teams might share the work in a given case pretty considerably. That is not part of the scoring rubric. So whether one person talks or 5 or 6 people talk, the judges should not be considering that differently. So now let's move on to ethical analysis. When you talk about ethical analysis, there's a whole series of things to keep in mind. So the first is that teams should show clear use of ethical reasoning in support of their position. It's also important that their analysis should be logically plausible, and I'm going to explain in a minute why this is a really important point and how it differs from something that might be easy to confuse it with. An analysis may include explicit use of ethical theory, but does not need to do so, and this is a very important point. Often teams, judges, participants in the Ethics Bowl debate this. The Ethics Bowl was explicitly not created as an ethical theory bowl, and a team could do a good job with an ethical analysis without explicitly referring to an ethical theory. They might, for example, make use of certain ethical principles, and they still might use very well reasoned and with clear logic, educated response. So it's important to note that. Following on that is the idea of ethical theory. I mentioned that earlier as well. But any use of ethical theory should be explained or clear to an educated person. One thing for teams and judges to keep in mind on this is that participants have the burden of making sure that their understanding of ethical theory is clear to the judges in the room. And also, it's the case that if a judge happens to know a lot about a particular ethical theory and the team begins to discuss it, they've sort of opened the door to be challenged on some of their understanding of that theory. The value of the use of ethical theory entirely depends on whether it advances or deepens an understanding of the salient ethical features of the case. So what does this mean? Really what this is getting at is that teams should not be rewarded simply for quote-unquote name dropping or listing a whole series of ethical theories. What's important is whether the use of ethical theory helps them advance the ethical understanding of the case. Another component that often gets discussed under ethical analysis is the idea of research. So the mere presence or absence of research should not impact scores. The value of research depends entirely on whether it advances or deepens the understanding of the salient ethical features of the case. So sometimes a team will have a lot of facts that they might bring into the case. If those facts help deepen the understanding of the analysis, that can be extremely valuable. If it seems like white noise, then they shouldn't be credited simply for having done a bunch of research. But of course, there are times where research would substantively help a discussion, and so judges should take that into consideration. So earlier I mentioned the idea of logical plausibility, and this is important because of the issue of judge disagreement with the team's position. So you see this point, disagreement with the team's view should not negatively impact the judge's score for a team. And this is hard because often as a judge, if you disagree, we tend to think, well, I only disagree with you because you were unpersuasive, your argument was poor, etc. But it's very important, and this is the next point, to separate a logical flaw in an argument from a disagreement with the team's conclusion. Often, judges might start with some value preference that is different from the presenting team's value preference, and so will automatically be led to a different conclusion about the quote-unquote right answer to the case. That is a case where disagreement should not negatively impact scoring. But if your disagreement is based on the fact that you think that the case presented by a team really was lacking in its sort of logical consistency, then that's where it would be reasonable to penalize a team for that. Perhaps the hardest category for teams in their initial presentations is the consideration of alternative viewpoints. So it's important to keep a couple of things in mind. First, the team should show an awareness that there may be more than one set of reasons in support of their conclusion. So this is important to note. So it's not only that teams might consider views that someone who might disagree with them would offer, but also that they might arrive at their conclusion in a couple of different ways. But of course, teams should also show an awareness that there are a set of reasons that might support an alternative view. And this is particularly the part of this category that should be highlighted in scoring. Teams should not just mention arguments in favor of opposing views or objections to their views, but also show evidence of appreciating the merits of those views and responding thoughtfully to them. So one thing you might see sometimes is a team that will say, well, we understand there may be the following objections to our view, and they list them, but they don't discuss them, they don't explain why they think they can overcome them. That's not a real consideration of alternative views. And finally, this is an important thing to keep in mind. Some teams will say, now we will consider objections. Other teams will not, but the way they lay out their analysis implies that they are thinking back and forth through an issue, and so that they are considering alternative viewpoints as they think through their position. And so they should not be scored down simply for not saying the words, now we will consider objections. In order to make these videos more digestible, we're going to be recording them as a series of videos. And so I'm going to try to keep each video to under 15 minutes. So I'm going to end this video here, and I'll come back in a second video talking about the commentary on the initial presentation, the response to commentary, and the judge's Q&A. Thanks very much.